Good evening, everyone. We are going to commence the second installment of our summer reading series on Ethics of Our Fighters by Rabbi Dr. Shlomo Brody. This week, we're going to be covering through the end of section 1. We're going to pick up where we left off. We left off last week. We did not cover all of our intended material because we spent some time on introduction. So really, we're going to cover from chapter 3 all the way through the end of chapter 9. But as it happens, chapter 3 thematically relates to a lot of the things that we're going to discuss this week. So it may not be the worst thing that we didn't complete our reading, if you will, last week. Again, before we get into substance and material, just one note. I noted last week that there were going to be some schedule changes, and indeed there are. We'll announce all the formal changes, but in the short end of it is we're going to have another session next week. After that, we're going to be on hiatus for, I think, 2 weeks. That's my Israel trip. And basically, based on the calendar, we're going to be on hiatus for 2 weeks. During that hiatus, though, we will have the opportunity to hear from Rabbi Brody himself. I will not be here. But for those of you who will be here, there will be an opportunity to hear from Rabbi Brody. That's when he will be in America. I think he'll be in America when I'll be in Israel. And then afterwards, we'll conclude with the final segments of the book. What I want to do tonight is a little bit different than what we did last week. Insofar as last week, we kind of, again, did a lot of introductory material. And then we went chapter by chapter, talking about some of the main points. I tried to elucidate, tried to highlight some of the points that Rabbi Brody does not discuss, and try to flesh out some of the shita. So Rav Kook that he was discussing, Rav Soloveitchik, etc. Well, we'll get into Rav Soloveitchik this week, but Rav Kook and some of the other shitos that he was talking about. This week, instead of going chapter by chapter, what I want to do is identify 3 sweeping themes that I think very much characterize much of the segment that we just read in the book, much of what he calls section 1 of his book. And for each of them, we'll try to break it down and kind of collate many of the themes, again, running through much of the book without focusing on any particular part, but really bringing together multiple segments of the book to try to flesh out those themes. And the themes that I want to talk about tonight are, number 1, international law and the role it plays in Jewish military ethics, if any role at all, if it does play any role at all. The second is the question of reprisal killings, which is a major theme in this first segment of the book. Is there any justification? If there are others who are not abiding by the rules of law, whatever the rules of law may be, is there justification for a kind of reprisal where you act in a similar fashion as much as you don't want to? Lamentably, if that's the strategy that's going to be effective, are you allowed to? Are you required to? Is it recommended? Is it frowned upon? What is the Jewish perspective on reprisal? And number 3, the most broad question, which I think really serves as a coda to what we began discussing last week, is the question of, is there a Jewish ethic of war? Obviously, the premise of this book is that there is, but he spends much time discussing that basic premise. Is it really so obvious that there's a Jewish ethic of war? And if there is, how do we derive it? He really tries in the later chapters to kind of flesh out the basis for a Jewish ethic of war and what it might look like in its broadest contours. So those are the 3 themes that I want to talk about tonight. For each, we'll talk about some of the themes that Rabbi Brody discusses in his book. And for each, we will also relate it to the themes of today. I think if there's one, I guess, meta theme in this book, it is Ein Kol Chadash Tachas Hashamesh. As much as this is, again, a remarkable work, the challenges that we face as a Jewish people are challenges that we have faced before. And in many ways, they're if you want to call it Maisa Avosim and Labanim, basically what our grandparents and great-grandparents had to deal with, we have to deal with in new iterations and perhaps to new degrees. Certainly, again, October 7th, I'd say in quality and quantity, was something that I think was really harkens back to the Holocaust and pre-Holocaust, not so much in the modern state of Israel. But lots of the challenges that they faced are challenges that we continue to face now. And it certainly provides perspective on the challenges that we face in our own time. So let's begin with a discussion of international law, which really begins in chapter 3, but permeates much of our reading for tonight. If you could open up to don't open up just yet. First, just some broad introduction. As I said last week, as Rabbi Brody mentioned in his introduction, this is not just a sterile discussion of military ethics. It's very much the story of individuals, of people as well. And that's certainly true in this segment on international law. Rabbi Brody begins by introducing us to several Jewish personalities who were actually instrumental in setting up the basic foundations of international law during the interwar period. Basically, you have World War I. It was the worst war that humanity, frankly, had ever seen in terms of the scale, in terms of the scope, qualitatively, in terms of the types of modern weaponry that was used. It was a horrific affair. And humanity as a whole came out just reeling from that experience and wondering what they could do to try to make sure that it would not be repeated and that humanity can trend in a positive direction. Obviously, they failed, but they didn't know that at the time. They were trying to work on new structures to try to prevent the horrors of the Great War. And one of the avenues that many people pursued was this notion of international law. We now have this League of Nations. We have this international group. Countries are going to work together. No longer are there going to be just narrow competing interests, but there's going to be broad consensus as well. And part of that broad consensus is we'll all agree on a set of rules, of do's and don'ts, that will dictate what is fair game during warfare and what is not. There was still a recognition that there would probably be wars. There wasn't, at least for many people, there wasn't some kind of delusion that everyone was just going to live in peace and harmony for the rest of history. But they wanted to at least contain those wars to avoid the horrors of World War I. And you had several Jews who were involved in those efforts. So he introduces us to Hirsch Tzvi Lauterpacht, who, again, I had never heard about before reading the book. He is the person who apparently coined the phrase crimes against humanity and was very involved in the Nuremberg trials later after World War II. Jacob Robinson was also very involved in the Nuremberg trials. And again, was one of these foundational figures in international law. He also mentions he mentions this figure in passing, but it happens to be this is the figure that in my own studies I find particularly compelling. He mentions Raphael Lemkin. Lemkin is a name that he really just, again, mentions in passing. Lemkin, if my memory serves me correctly, is actually the person who coined the phrase or coined the term genocide. He is the one who actually invented the term genocide. It was after the Holocaust. He was a Jewish guy. He needed some new term to characterize this otherworldly crime. Basically, he just felt that the human vocabulary did not have words to describe the magnitude of the crime of the Holocaust, so he had to come up with one. And he just experimented with lots of different terms, and he ultimately came to the term genocide. It's not just a homicide, which is on an individual level. Genocide is the destruction of an entire people. Now, I mentioned that because parenthetically, I will note that what is happening now is the exact antithesis of what Lemkin was trying to achieve. Lemkin witnessed the Holocaust. He says this is something that needs its own term. And he realized I needed to coin a new term and invent a new word in the English language or languages in general so that we can capture these kinds of horrific crimes. And he came up with the term genocide. Now, with that term genocide being so grotesquely appropriated and misapplied, you've almost had the opposite effect. Now the word genocide effectively means nothing. This word that Lemkin created to describe these kind of horrific crimes has been politicized to such a great degree, and again, has been so grotesquely misapplied in the context of the ICC, and again, in context of public discourse in general, that it's lost its effect because it's been used as such the term genocide has come to mean defensive war, or at least, again, in the context of Israel, when Israel fights a defensive war, they say Israel is committing genocide. So that whole term that he tried to create to capture a new scale of horrific crime has totally been undermined by the misuse of the term in recent discipline. But you do have these Jews who are very much involved in establishing international law and trying to use this as an avenue to limit future conflicts. Now, what is the rabbinic perspective and what is the rabbinic relationship with international law? So we have, I guess, a range of perspectives, like most issues. When it comes to rabbinic opinion, there will be a range of perspectives. That's something that we'll address a little later on. But you definitely have some rabbis who are adopting it, who are viewing it positively. Perhaps the most dramatic example is in a later chapter. Rabbi Brody talks about Rav Shaul Yisraeli, who was a Talmud of Rav Kook, who argued that there is no Jewish military ethic, a pretty shocking view that we'll return to also a little later tonight. So he argued in the absence of a Jewish military ethic, what do you have? He says Jews are obligated to abide by international conventions. Now, he didn't say international law, he said international military conventions. In other words, Jews should abide by the ethics that all other militaries abide by. And the difference between that, conventions, and military law or international law is quite significant, as we will also flesh out in just a moment. But you did have some rabbinic personalities who viewed it very positively. However, it also became clear, even in those early days, and certainly in retrospect, many decades later, that there were going to be very significant problems with this system of international law. What were some of those problems? So if you open up to page 50, he begins to document what some of even the early proponents and heroes of international law came to recognize what what problems would exist in this system of international law. So the first problem was it was recognized again by certain figures early on. He quotes Rabbi Hirschenhorn, who we introduced last week, who said that this is all nice in theory, this notion that all nations will get along and they'll all agree to a set of standards and they will all limit conflict and, again, try to create this new harmonious future, or at least limit the horrors of the future. But he said, ultimately, this will not be driven by ethical considerations, but rather by narrow political interests. Every country who has a seat at the table has their own political agenda. And because they have their own political agenda, ultimately that will be what governs international law rather than the actual ethical principles upon which it is supposed to be based. Take a look at the third paragraph. What's the second full paragraph? In the middle of page 50. Lauterpacht, the rising jurist now teaching at University College of London, lamented the tepid British response. This is talking about the Hebron massacre, the tepid British response to the Hebron massacre, and its failure to ascribe full blame to the Arab side. Why did the British fail to protect the Jews? Lauterpacht's answer was telling, and this is a chilling line. Even the mighty British Empire had to cower before the prospect of a religious war with all of Islam. Britain cared about minority rights, but it had to take into consideration its own political interest in placating the feelings of the millions of Muslims who lived within its empire. So this is his conclusion. Again, this is somebody who is inclined towards international law, who's one of the early heroes of international law, who is lamenting the fact that this is 1929. So this is let's say the 1930s we're talking about. The British response to a massacre is governed by narrow political interests rather than moral clarity on the actual issue. And if this was true in the 1930s, this was before mass immigration into Europe. This was before the UK, he's talking about the UK right now, before the UK or France had massive populations, again, of massive Muslim minority populations. And again, I don't want to make any sweeping generalizations, but certainly among those, there are some who are disinclined to condemn the Hebron massacre. And as a result, you see that kind of development that already started decades ago, that already started almost a century ago, that's just magnified dramatically in the current era when those concerns that Lauterpacht was identifying, those political interests or political fears that he was identifying on part of the British Empire, are so much more acute and so much more immediate for England, for France, for the European powers than they were a century ago. So the first issue that you have is this question of it being driven by politics. And Robinson was bothered by the same thing. If you look at the bottom of page 51, while Lauterpacht would continue to promote international legal protections as a judge on the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, slightly different from the ICC, but there are plenty of problems with the ICJ too, as we've learned recently, his colleague Robinson became more skeptical of its potential efficacy. After Israel's founding, Robinson served as a leading advisor on diplomacy and international law to the Israeli delegation at the United Nations. He was wary of the prospects of the UN providing real solutions to human rights problems. Its genocide convention, developed in the wake of the Holocaust, was too vague and lacked any enforcement mechanism that would make it efficient. Moreover, it and other UN initiatives would be manipulated by Israel's Arab neighbors and minorities to attack the Jewish state, even as these countries would do nothing to respect the human rights of minorities in their own lands. It sounds prophetic reading it 100 years later, but this is exactly what they foresaw in terms of the problems with international law. The second problem, which it really is just an extension of the first, is dramatic hypocrisy when it comes to the Jewish state, because it is driven by political interests. And I would say also because it's governed by people, and there are many people in the world who are either overtly or subconsciously consumed by the world's oldest hatred, by just plain old anti-Semitism. The Israel in the body of nations is the Jew on the individual level. Israel is the Jew in the body of nations. And therefore, you have this dramatic hypocrisy when it comes to applying these international law standards to the Jewish state. I'm not going to read, there's a passage, if you look at the first paragraph on page 53, I'm not going to read it right now, but I think it's an excellent encapsulation of so many of the instances of just grave and dramatic hypocrisy when it comes to the application of international law to the Jewish state. If you want another one, Professor Shia Leibowitz on page 92 in a later section also discusses, again, we won't read it all inside, but if you look on page 92, here too, he just talks about how Israel is subject to standards that many others are very much not. So that is a second layer of the problem. I will note in passing that these two problems very much governed what I said before, that Rabbi Yisraeli did not endorse observing international law, but what did he say? International conventions. What are other countries doing, not what are other countries saying? And a lot of that is, again, I don't know if it was overtly due to this issue, but certainly it would answer many of these issues. And you actually have precedent for that in other areas of halakha. I'll give you an example. There's a principle in halakha called dina de malchus dina. What does dina de malchus dina mean? That you need to observe the laws of the land. You need to pay your taxes, and you need to observe basic laws. What are the parameters of it? What's the scope? Interesting question. Maybe something that we will come back to tonight, actually, in a different context. But you need to observe the laws of the land. So does that mean that jaywalking is prohibited from the Torah? It's an issur d'oraisa to cross against the light? So the answer is no, I don't recommend it. Everybody should be safe. But at the same time, would that constitute an issur d'oraisa? No, because it's not enforced. Yes, it's on the books. Technically speaking, you could be ticketed for it, but nobody's ticketed for it. And if you do it in front of a cop, in 99% of times, you're not going to be ticketed either, as long as you're not doing anything egregiously dangerous, as long as you're acting in a safe manner. So that is not a violation of dina de malchusa. Dina de malchusa is not just contingent on what laws are on the books, but how are they actually enforced? Your Yisraeli said, and again, this was perhaps wise, that when it comes to Jewish military ethics, I don't care about what international bodies say. I don't care about what they say is moral or immoral, and they only apply to the Jewish state and to no other country in the world. What matters to me are what are the ethical standards of international conventions. What are other countries doing? That moral standard, the Jewish state is obligated certainly to rise to and perhaps above, but he did try to, again, it does resolve for some of these issues regarding just the blatant hypocrisy when it comes to application to the Jewish state. And the final problem with international law, and again, this is, I think, one that very much stands out today, is the fact that there's no framework for what to do when laws are broken. He highlights this on page 101, where he says, the notion of turn the other cheek, which is, of course, a Christian ethic, he says, that's a very nice moral principle, but it's hardly the basis for an actual framework for constructing moral law. He's quoting here, he's not quoting a Jewish thinker, he's quoting a general who said, what do the framers of it's the first paragraph of page 101. I'm quoting from the middle. What do the framers of the protocol expect state B to do when state A is violating the protocols? Turn the other cheek? That is a religious tenet rather than a serious military or political proposition. The entire system of international law, he feared, will collapse if countries find their standards to be unfair or unrealistic. And this is a point that I spoke about on Shavuos when we were talking about these topics, that I think, again, the world has just gone so radically astray on this particular point. It's nice to have international laws that seek to limit the horrors of conflict. But how do those laws respond when one side is not observing them? And is there any kind of recourse or mechanism for the other side to respond? The way I put that on Shavuos is the following. The world loves to lecture Israel on all the things it can't do. You can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do this, you can't do that. What the world is really bad at answering is, so what is Israel supposed to do? Let's say you're dealing with somebody who at least recognizes basic facts. They recognize that Hamas committed the atrocity of October 7th, that they're interested in doing it, quote, again and again and again, that they're openly, they're not bashful, they're not subtle. They said they intend to rearm and they intend to conduct this attack again. So again, if we're acknowledging basic facts and we have basic fairness, we'd realize that Israel probably wants to do something about that, right? So it's very easy to tell Israel all the things that it can't do when you have a terrorist organization that fights underground, underneath hospitals, underneath mosques, underneath schools. It's very easy to say you can't do A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So what can Israel do? And if the answer to that is nothing, then the whole system of international law has failed. It's collapsed. It's worthless and it's meaningless. If the answer is you just need to sit back and be massacred, then the whole system becomes pointless. Or the way I put it then as well is, if it was really just about all the things that you can't do, then it's very easy. Get together, get all the nations together, make a proclamation. It says 2 words, no war. You want to make it 3 words, no more war. No more war. 3 words, very easy. Everybody sign it. Why don't they do that? Because there's a recognition that there will be conflicts. And the goal is to construct not just things that you can't do, but a way that you can conduct a conflict that is within the confines of moral behavior. If you can't tell a nation, this is the way that you can conduct your just war, conduct your self-defensive war, let's say, in a way that is acceptable to the international community, then you just rendered the entire system meaningless. The entire system is a joke. And we saw it right before Shavuos the hostage rescue. That was one area where you saw it like so dramatically, where civilians, again, we're not even going to get into where the number came from, the number of Palestinians who were killed. We're not even going to get into the question that it does not distinguish, as the Gaza Health Ministry, the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry never distinguishes between combatants and civilians. So without even getting into those points, let's say there were civilians that were killed in this rescue operation of hostages, right? So there was a BBC reporter who asked Jonathan Conricus, who we had speak here in B'nai Yeshurun, who asked Jonathan Conricus, did you issue a warning before you did this secret operation to rescue your hostages? And he was just like baffled by the question. He's like, are you asking if we warned the terrorists before we conducted our secret operation to rescue our hostages? But that was the expectation, right? So what effectively the world is saying when it asks that question, what effectively it's saying, if we just translate, is you cannot rescue your hostages. That's what the world is saying. If they're hid among civilians, again, it's perverse. We don't condone it. But at the same time, if that's what happens, then you cannot rescue your hostages. You saw the same thing happen more recently with the assassination on Mohammed Deif, the attempted assassination, hopefully successful assassination on Mohammed Deif. Deif is probably the number 2 target that Israel has after Yahya Sinwar himself. It's probably the number 2 target, and in some ways an even more valuable target because of the many times that he's avoided Israeli assassination attempts. So they really, again, the intelligence here was a remarkable success. They waited. They had the information on another important Hamas commander, Salameh, but they wanted Deif, so they waited. And they waited till Deif visited Salameh because they knew they had a close relationship. It really was a pretty remarkable intelligence effort. And then they bombed the compound where they were. And what did the international community say? Israel bombs a structure within the Israel designated humanitarian zone, and X number of Palestinians are killed. Number one, there's no discussion of the fact that Hamas built a compound in the Israel designated humanitarian zone, right? Like, so that's one manipulation of this system of international law. Number two, when you have a high profile target, it's not that Israel's trying to target, again, I want to emphasize again, there was no distinction between combatants and civilians. And insofar as this was a Hamas compound, my assumption is the overwhelming majority of fatalities were Hamas operatives of some sort. But even if civilians were killed, you weren't targeting civilians, you were targeting a very high profile, high value military target. And in doing so, there were others who were tragically and lamentably killed, but that wasn't the target. And if your response is, then, you just hide your military targets among civilians, and then you can't do anything, you have no way to access your military goals or access your military targets, then you've just rendered the system a joke. You've rendered the system meaningless. And we see that time and time again, whereby Israel is consistently told what you can't do without creating any framework for what Israel can do in terms of operating, in terms of executing its military goals. So I think a lot of the problems that they foresaw with international law and that they saw in their early stages, we are seeing in just a much more dramatic and acute way in our current environment. And we should just be aware of what the issues are. And we should also have like a clear-eyed, sober perspective on what international law is supposed to be and what it is not, what it should be doing, what it is not doing, and the flaws in the system from an ethical standpoint, and the ways it's so gravely misapplied to the one Jewish state in the world. So that is the topic of international law. Marav is at 8:15 tonight, so I don't think we're going to get to all 3 of our issues, but let's strive to do issue number 2, which is the question of reprisal killings. So reprisal killings is another major theme in this chapter. And the basic question is as follows. Fedayeen, Palestinian skirmishers, come into the country, and this was happening for the first, let's say decade or 2 of the country, not decade, or let's say until 1967, maybe. You have these skirmishers, and this was certainly happening through the 1950s, that are coming into the country, that are coming in through Jordan, they're coming in through Egypt, and they're in some cases engaged doing vandalism. They're breaking water pipes. They're burning olive trees and things like that, which is not a small deal either when you're in a desert country. At the time, Israel was mostly a desert country, which you're trying to agriculturally cultivate. But fine, sometimes they're doing that. Sometimes they're killing children. Sometimes they're throwing a grenade into a house, and whoever's inside, again, he quotes a case where a mother and her 3 children were killed. So they're indiscriminately attacking, and they are attacking civilians. Is it okay to respond in kind, to go and target civilians? as a means towards getting it to stop? That was effectively the question that he is posing. Now, at the very outset, I want to be very clear about my stance on this issue, because I think it is the mainstream rabbinic stance on this issue. We do not hold that even if our enemies deliberately target women and children, that we should ever deliberately target women and children. I want to be very clear and unequivocal about that. But for the purpose of our intellectual discussion right now, let's consider the possibility. If indeed that's the way to get the attacks to stop, is that immoral? Maybe that is the moral choice. It's horrible that we're called upon to do such a thing, but maybe that is, again, in an abstract, conceptual sense, maybe that's the moral thing to do. And you definitely had arguments between different strategies that were adopted by different thinkers and different organizations. You had the Haganah versus the Etzel. The Haganah adopted a strategy of Havlaga. They would basically ignore. And the Etzel had a strategy of Tiguvah. They would respond. Mind you, as Rabbi Brody points out, this is the Etzel before Menachem Begin. Menachem Begin adopted a major shift in tactics and strategy, whereby the attacks of the Etzel were focused. The Etzel is, of course, the Irgun Tzvai Le'umi, the paramilitary group that's most associated nowadays, historically, with Menachem Begin and his leadership. But he shifted the focus to not target civilians, but to target British military targets. And that's a very important thing to know, insofar as we often associate the Etzel with Menachem Begin, and insofar as Begin is one of the great, if not the great, prime minister of Israel's history. It's important to note that. But the early Etzel would engage in those kind of reprisal attacks. And he notes that there was a debate among rabbinic figures as well. He quotes a Rav Maimon, who was actually supportive of reprisal attacks. But as I said before, all the major names in early Israeli rabbinic leadership, Rav Herzog, Rav Uziel, they were all opposed to it. So what are the arguments for? What are the arguments against? And where exactly do they leave us in terms of our analysis? The basic argument for is the ends justify the means. The ends justify the means. This is not something that anyone wants to do. It's a horrible thing. But if the alternative is our own women and children being slaughtered, and if this is actually going to stop it, it could be that this is actually a Rahmanus. It could be that this is stopping the murder and the deaths of women and children, because perhaps this will actually achieve deterrence, and it will actually minimize deaths and civilian deaths as well. I think this argument also rests on challenging the distinction between civilians and combatants. What is the distinction between civilian and combatants? If you're interested, again, we're not going to read it inside right now, but he poses a fascinating thought experiment on page 99 of the book. He contrasts a young man who is anti-war, but he's drafted by his country's military, and he serves. Once he was drafted, he serves, versus an older man who wasn't drafted simply because he's not in the peak of his physical prowess, but is very rabidly pro-war and works in a military manufacturing company. So he says, who's the civilian, who's the combatant? He says, technically speaking, the kid wearing the uniform is the combatant, even though he himself, on a personal level, is anti-war, and the neighbor that he has, who's not technically serving for, again, due to technicalities because he's not physically fit, but is very pro-war, he's the civilian. But so he again poses like interesting questions about who qualifies as a civilian and a combatant. And I've discussed that question in the past. We're not going to discuss it tonight, particularly in a modern warfare context, fighting a guerrilla war with a population that is largely supportive. At least major segments of the population are supportive. That is a very difficult question to answer. But the basic argument is ends justify the means. What is the argument against? Well, if the argument is the ends justify the means, then the response is going to be the ends don't justify the means. He gives three different reasons. If you look at pages 102 to 103, three different reasons why you wouldn't do it even in order to achieve that end. He gives one answer of virtue and honor. The honor of the soldier doesn't engage in that kind of activity. National exceptionalism. He quotes Senator John McCain, talking about American exceptionalism in the context of World War II. He was, in the context of Vietnam. He was, of course, a POW, but McCain insisted that we as Americans are exceptional and we're not going to engage in the kind of brutal, horrific tactics that our enemies do. And the third reason he gives is human dignity, recognition of the dignity of all human beings. I think, again, I appreciate the moral framework, but that's an overcomplication of a very simple matter. What is the argument against? Killing kids is wrong. You don't really need to go much further than that. From a Torah standpoint, deliberately targeting children is an evil thing to do. I don't care what the ends may be. at least in most circumstances, as he discusses a little bit in these chapters. What if it's an existential crisis or a crisis of extreme magnitude? But in almost all circumstances, it's just the wrong thing to do, and the ends do not justify the means. Now, a few points to make here, and I'm going to try to make these points as quickly as I can. One of the classic arguments for, as I said, was this questioning of the line between combatants and civilians, which I think is a very legitimate question, but I think it was misapplied in one particular way. If you look at a lot of the discourse that Brody describes that was justifying reprisal killings, the argument was, war is terrible, war is a horrible thing, but it's lamentable that it's a horrible thing, but that's the nature of war. War is a collective endeavor, which is a notion that emerges from Maharal and other sources. It's one nation against another. And because it's a collective endeavor, there are horrible things that happen. What's the response to that? The response is, yes, that is true, but there is a major gulf. There's a major difference between the horrors of war that are part of the reality of war and deliberately, consciously targeting those who are, let's say, again, let's just deal with very young children, those who are innocent. Let's deal with children ages 0 to 4. So there's a very big difference between hitting a military target that lamentably kills a child versus deliberately targeting one. And that's the response that you have on part of Rav Uziel, Rav Herzog, those who do not justify reprisal killings. I'll just note, again, another irony, whereby I think that distinction is often lost, but in the opposite direction and used as a kind of a method of bludgeoning Israel, a method of like just really distorting what exactly is happening in Israel and Gaza right now, and using it as a way to really using it as a way to pillory Israel falsely. In other words, Israel's critics will often just do the following. They'll put up two numbers, the numbers of Jewish Israelis, or just let's say Israelis, killed since October 7th, and the number of Palestinians killed since October 7th. And they'll say, look, the numbers make the case. That's it. It's just a question of pure numbers. Look how many orders of magnitude, not orders of magnitude, it's one order of magnitude, but look how much higher the number is on one side of the ledger than on the other side of the ledger. You see, clearly Israel is wrong. Clearly Israel is evil. Clearly Israel is settler colonialist, whatever, again, good. Whatever other litany of slanderous terms they're going to use about Israel. But of course, they're missing a very basic distinction. What is the motive? And the motive makes a huge difference in these cases. It makes a huge difference. It's not just a question of numbers. In one instance, you had a group that was deliberately targeting women, children, elderly, etc. On the other hand, you have another group, i.e. Tzahal, that is trying to fight against those people to defend their people. And again, there is lamentably, largely due to deliberately embedding terrorist infrastructure among civilian infrastructure, there is, there are civilian casualties as well, which is tragic. But you can't just put up the numbers and say, oh, if you want to say war is terrible, it's clearly more terrible for one side than the other side. So clearly that side are the righteous side, and the side that has less casualties is the evil side. It's facile, and it's a ridiculous comparison because it loses that very distinction that, again, Rav Uziel, Rav Herzog were articulating between the horrors of war, which is a terrible part of war, but it is a part of war, versus deliberate targeting, which is a different matter entirely. That's not war, that's terrorism. And that is the distinction that those early Rabbanim, and I think the rabbinic consensus, makes between the two. Now, I'd say that there is a kasav hashlishi, but even, in other words, a third option between these two, but even that I think is predicated on very particular premises that need to be in place in order for the argument to work. I'll start with what the third approach is, which is, again, he doesn't describe this directly in the book, but he kind of alludes to it. It's what I would call targeted collective punishment. Targeted collective punishment seems like a contradiction in terms. So what exactly is targeted collective punishment? What I mean by that is a kind of collective punishment that is very targeted in terms of what it does and what it does, more importantly, what it does not do, and how it seeks to achieve the ends by saying that some means are justified, but not all means. And I think this would most be associated with the philosophy that he ascribes to Rav Shaul Yisraeli, who we spoke about before, the Talmud of Rav Kook. Rabbi Israeli was talking about international norms and what do countries do? And he made the argument that if you look at Allied conduct during World War II, there was some measure of collective punishment in the way they conducted the war. At the same time, Rabbi Israeli said, you can't ever deliberately target children. Why? Because you want to say the ends justify the means? He says, maybe the ends justify some means. But that means targeting children, that's just too far. That you cannot justify. That is not okay. So it's a kind of I'm calling it a kasavash shlishi. It's kind of a middle option insofar as it's very targeted. It will allow certain things in order to achieve important military ends, but it's very measured in terms of what it will allow. And frankly, this is something that Tzahal does employ today. Take an example. Before this whole war, if there was a terror attack, what is one of the rules that exists in Israel? What will Tzahal do? They won't just incarcerate the terrorists and put them on trial, et cetera, et cetera. The home of the terrorist is demolished. Why? Why do they do that? Because then if you have a young radicalized man who is intent on committing a terror attack, he may be willing to give up his own life because, again, he wants to die as a shaheed, he wants to die as a martyr, and he wants the reward that's going to come afterwards. But now all of a sudden, he needs to think about his elderly mother and his nephew and niece who are also living in that house, and then it's a different calculation. And then they won't necessarily conduct a terror attack because they have that additional piece to consider. Now, rights activists, again, who are more often than not just interested in finding ways to condemn Israel, so that's collective punishment. You're punishing the old grandmother, you're punishing the nephew, you're punishing the niece. And on a strict and narrow level, there is accuracy to that assertion. But I think it's a world apart from saying, let's say, again, Rahman al-Islam, we're going to kill the nephew and niece, right? Rabbi Israeli said, like, that form of collective punishment is in no way justifiable, irrespective of what ends it's going to achieve. So this kind of middle status, where there are some means that we will justify, but not all, is perhaps a third way, a third approach between these two extremes. Now, I will say, and I'll close with this, because I know we have to get to Mincha. There are preconditions for this to work, this kasavash shlishi. Number one, if the whole argument is ends justify the means, the first thing you need to make sure is that the ends are truly achieved. That's the first thing. And again, you need to make sure that this is actually effective at achieving the deterrence that you seek to achieve. If not, then it obviously falls apart. But a second thing that he also, again, alludes to in the book as a motif, and maybe we'll pick up with this next time because we're not going to have time to flesh it out fully, is the difference between reprisal versus revenge, deterrence versus vengeance. If one is doing this, it can't come from a place of anger, of hatred, of bloodthirst, of bloodlust. It can't come from a place where you desire to kill and therefore you are doing so. It needs to come from a place of reluctance, of reticence, of deep hesitation, but recognition, clear-eyed recognition that it is necessary in order to achieve some military aims. He makes reference on several occasions, and again, we're not going to talk about this tonight. We'll talk about it next week, and we might have to extend this series based on the progress that I'm making here or the progress that I'm not making here. But he makes reference to a quote from Rav Soloveitchik's Kol Dov Didofek, which I am very fond of, which is the fifth knock. The fifth knock is where Rav Soloveitchik speaks about the fact that Jewish blood, after the foundation of the state of Israel, is no longer cheap. In Kol Dov Didofek, Rav Soloveitchik notes that the 6 knocks of redemption, ways in which God is calling to us, is hearkening to us. And the 5th knock he describes is the fact that Jewish blood is no longer cheap. And when Rav Soloveitchik describes it, he describes it in almost militant terms, that if people will seek Jewish blood, we will go after them in turn. It's the kind of thing that if you didn't know it was attributed to Rav Soloveitchik, you never would have guessed. You could have guessed a lot of other figures, but you never would have guessed that it was attributed to Rav Soloveitchik that he said those words. But to me, that's precisely where its power lies, because of the fact that it's being said by Rav Soloveitchik, not by some kind of, again, military official, not by a general, not by a commander, not by somebody who's engaged in conflict, not by somebody who's associated with conflict at all. A man who was a scholar, who was gentle-mannered. You could see that it's coming from a place where he believes it's true, he believes it's necessary, he believes it is correct morally. It is not at all coming from a place of, as I said before, vengeance, anger, hate, bloodlust, etc. So when you have that factor of reticence, reluctance, not a desire to take blood, God forbid, but a reluctant feeling that it's necessary, and therefore I will do what is necessary because it is morally required, that I think is a precondition for this to even potentially work as well. Be'ez Hashem, next week we'll return to the question of is there a Jewish ethic of war? We'll start with the passage from Rav Soloveitchik and we'll take it from there. Have a good night, everyone.